For a lot of students, they're not going to learn a technique just because you ask them to learn it. Don't take it personally. It's not like they hate you, and it's not like you hate them for not doing it. They just have no reason to do it in their minds. So if we go to the hierarchy pyramid again, we can talk about values and how to encourage a student to practice and to try their best, by explaining why orchestra is important and so on, and why they're there, and get them to address those whys. But accountability goes beyond just that. As a classroom teacher, we can set up accountability in a variety of different ways. And one of the best ways to teach technique is to teach it in a way that holds the student accountable to that technique, to where if they use that technique correctly, they succeed, and if they don't use it correctly, they don't succeed, and they can adjust to the correct technique. So what kind of accountability measures can we put in place to develop good left-hand tone? One of the easiest ones is just checking to see where our string indentations are on our fingers. So you can just ask your students, hey, look at your fingers. Where do you see the indentation? Now, I've heard great violinists say you should never have finger indentations. If you have finger indentations, you're pressing too hard. That's great if they can do it that way. I've never been able to do that myself. I don't know how they do it. Maybe somebody can drop a comment and tell me how that works. But for me, I always have finger indentations. The more I practice, the more calluses I get, but I can still definitely see where the fingers are pressing into the strings. But for students, for sure, they've got finger indentations all over the place. And one method of accountability is just to pause and say, hey, look, where are you actually contacting with the strings? It'll show you. And you can't mask it. It's there. On occasion, I've taken Sharpie or some kind of marker, and I've drawn on the fingers where they should be contacting versus where they were contacting. But the more I teach, the less I draw on my students. So that's being phased out. Legal expenses are getting to be too much, and so we're not doing that. But I think just looking at the indentations should be effective, and they should be able to visualize what they need to do differently. So we're in this cell phone culture where rarely do we have our shoulders back. Everybody's got their shoulders forward because we're on a screen all day. We're doing this, okay? And shoulder mobility is starting to reduce. What's happening is that the scapula, the upper scapula, and the rhomboids are actually atrophying because the shoulders are forward so much that they don't have to work, and that sort of creates tension and it creates upper back problems. But it's very difficult for us as string teachers because it affects the bow and it affects the left hand. So another method for accountability, just to get our low strings in particular to loosen up, is just doing bear hugs. Just reach over and hug, just loosen up, get into that cell phone posture, and then coming back to normal. So they're going back, they're going into the cello or bass, back out. This is also excellent to teach weight transfer, how to transfer your weight into the string with the bow and how to transfer the weight down with the left hand. Another great method for accountability is the Freezeit fixit method. Now, your students have to be prepared for this. If you do it just out of the blue and say, freeze, they'll think that there's a police raid going on or something like that. So you have to prepare them and tell them what you're going to do. You're going to say, I want you to play from rehearsal A to rehearsal B again, and at some point I'm going to tell you to freeze, and I want you to hold absolute still. And even after you tell them to hold absolute still, some of them are not going to do it. They're going to put their instrument down anyway. And you're going to say, now we're trying to do this, and you just moved, so we're not going to be able to figure out what we're doing wrong so we can fix it. But anyway, the Freezeit fixit method, once you get them set up to be able to respond to that method of accountability, you'll say freeze, and then you'll have them check something, and then they'll look and give it a long pause, 5 to 10 seconds for them to see what's wrong before you say, now fix it. And don't let them cheat on this. I want you to let them observe what they're doing incorrectly and let that sink in. Otherwise, that change won't occur. Another way to create accountability is to set up reference points in other parts of the body. So like for violin and viola, we want the scroll to be high enough, right? We don't want it to droop down. So we can create a reference point saying, is your scroll even with your nose? Okay, that's a reference point that they can visualize and observe. We can line up the neck of the violin and viola with the left foot. And you could say, is your neck lined up with your left foot? And this is assuming that their left foot is at the right angle. And hopefully one of the first things that you've done is set them up correctly so that it is, whether they're sitting or standing. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, head back over to my part 1 series on tone, where we talk about general instrument setup, and maybe that'll give you some tips. We can also create accountability for low string players and making sure that the distance from the shoulder to the neck of the instrument is adequate. So how far is adequate? Well, again, we can use that stuffed animal analogy. Imagine there's like a little stuffed animal on your shoulder. Are you crushing that stuffed animal, or is there enough space? The best measure of accountability is always when a student can be held accountable while they're playing in context and they can hear if the technique is reflected in their sound. So ringtones are a perfect measure for accountability with intonation and with tone. Do we hear the ringing sound? That's something that you can ask your class. Can you hear the ringing sound? Is it ringing? In our demonstration videos for this series, we're going to talk about a game that you can play with your beginners and maybe even with your advanced students on how to get the ringing sound. Another great measure for accountability, and something that's in quite a few method books, is the concept of tunneling. Now, I've seen a lot of classroom teachers teach through an entire series of books for years and years and not really point out where the tunneling is supposed to be occurring in the method book. You know, they have like the first finger mark and they have this line underneath, which means you're supposed to keep the first finger down. You know, they have this in the Essential Elements for Strings and the Wolfart method and several others. But it gets overlooked by a lot of people. You know, they don't read the fine print, and so they miss out on the accountability that the writers and the publishers put in place. But you don't need the method book to teach kids how to tunnel. It's easy. You just have them play an open string and you just have them finger 1, 2, 3, 4 up and down so that they can press the fingers without rubbing against the upper string that they're bowing. And if they do rub up against the string, you're going to hear it right away. You're going to start to get a whistle or some sort of harmonic, or the tone's going to be horrible, so they'll hear it. So how do we get students to visualize this natural curvature to the left hand so that they can do it effectively every time? A lot of my methods that I get in the classroom, I got from sports. And my best coaches always had just something they could shout out and everybody knew what they were talking about and everybody knew how to fix it. In this case, something that I use is tabletops. I'll shout out, tabletops, tabletops. If I start to see fingers collapsing or whatever, I'll say tabletops. And what do I mean by tabletops? So your tabletops are right up here. So with this joint right here, you can see they make like a little table. And so I just say tabletops. I say that along with like hook, thumb, and a lot of other different common mistakes. It's short, it's direct. I don't have to stop the entire class to say it. I don't have to give them a 40-minute lecture on technique. I just say tabletops, they know what I'm talking about, and they fix it. What we do with our tabletops is we control the distance of our moment arm so that we can apply the maximum amount of force with the minimum amount of effort. So if you say tabletops and you're trying to get them to play with a good left hand shape with round fingers and they're not responding to it, you might need to create some accountability so that they have to use tabletops in order to do what you're saying. And this is where tunneling comes in, because if they don't want to sound bad, they have to round those fingers out so that they don't rub up against or even press the open string as you're tunneling. So again, you're creating a situation where they have to learn the technique because it's required to do a certain skill. Where you could play Frere Jacques all day long and they'll never learn their tabletops because they don't need to.